all of us in the room, I think, have a pretty good sense that we have a rich heritage of wonderful buildings throughout the city. And it's really wonderful to be in a neighborhood where we actually can live that every day. So Victoria and I own a house in the Elmwood, South Elmwood Historic District. It's been a great pleasure to be a steward of that building and to try to understand its character. So being an architect, of course, I'm constantly interested in finding out why people, while my colleagues, former colleagues, historic colleagues, why they did what they did. And I always admire their accomplishments because I know full well how difficult it is to pull off sort of the magic of making a building happen. Most of you, of course, know buildings well from their outsides. And that's part of our public life, and many of us understand the styles that developed over time. We have a good sense of that historically, and we know, again, that this is a very, very wonderful place to understand those traditions and those changes. Inside buildings, we know slightly differently. Oftentimes, of course, we understand what they're like. Many of us live in historic houses of all types and all ages, and so some of the things I'll be speaking to you today, you're pretty familiar with them. So what I'm trying to do is sort of place in your mind the sort of wrangling that occurs in an architect's head as he or she starts to untangle sort of the life inside a building, at the same time as, of course, establishing an exterior or sort of life outside of a building, the one that we're very familiar with. So let's see if we can get started here. So I want to remind you, you are here, and as we discussed last week or 2 weeks ago with Deborah's presentation, this part of the city has a long history, and the sort of Knight Memorial Library is part of that tradition. And I show you this as an image because, of course, we'll be talking a little bit about plans. And plans are kind of images in 2D, if you will, 2 dimensions, of how we organize things in the city and even in houses. So keep in mind, in fact, that in many ways, house plans are like city plans. They have private parts and public parts, and they're all divided and connected in some way. And so part of the challenge of any architect is to sort of sort that out and arrange the pieces so they make some sense. So it's interesting to remind ourselves, of course, that this neighborhood has an important history in Providence, that it's been recognized that way for a long, long time. So I had the great pleasure of taking a look at these documents from the Historic District Commission, from the statewide historic surveys, some of this stuff we talked about last time. And of course, I happen to have a copy of this PPS brochure from 1983, where this neighborhood was reviewed. We had a chance to look at these buildings. And of course, I remind you, they're doing well. They're still here. They look wonderful. And they're still part of the sort of heritage of what we think of as this part of the city, this part of the neighborhood. So you'll have a chance to look at some of these buildings as we take the tour. Some of them are in great shape. Some of them are going to become in better shape pretty soon. And so that's a really important part of why we're all here today, is to celebrate the sort of stewardship of some of these magnificent buildings. So I want to remind you, as Deborah spoke 2 weeks ago, that Elmwood was kind of rural or suburban, if you would, in the middle of the 19th century. It was a kind of a place to get away. And it's difficult for us to imagine what it was like downtown. Now, the fabric of the city is there now, and so we can feel it, we can walk down the street, we can understand the wonders of the buildings. But the one thing which is different, of course, is the air is clean, the streets are clean, and it doesn't smell very bad. So in the end of the 19th century, Providence was a very, very bustling place. Most everything was moved around with horses. And so you can imagine that it was not that necessarily a pleasant place to wander about, particularly in the summertime. So basically, it was nice to get out of the city, and so oftentimes this neighborhood became a real refuge. So people could move out here where the air was fresh and clean, southern breezes from the west behind, moving to the downtown, so it was actually quite a pleasant place to be. So that idea of the suburb or kind of rural setting changed pretty radically and pretty fast. Again, as Deborah mentioned, with the development of Gorham and then many other manufacturing enterprises in the area. So very, very quickly, the area filled up with housing of all types and all sizes. So let's sort of think about this a little bit now in terms of this topic, an architect's view inside and out. And as some of you know, I teach at RISD, and one of the lectures that I give at school is called Skin and Bones. And it's about thinking about buildings as they are structure or interiors, and that's what they're like on the outside. So we'll talk about that today, which is really skin and bones, at the inside and the outsides, how they relate, and how we imagine a life occurring within and also without. So let's start at the beginning. One of the great things about being in Providence, of course, is we have this wonderful collection of wooden houses from colonial times through the beginning of the 20th century. Fantastic collection of buildings. Very, very rare to have so many different buildings from so many different periods. So that's a fantastic legacy for us to have. So you know this building, you know these buildings very well. The very, very earliest sort of solid buildings built in the 18th century, late 18th century particularly. And I just want to point out to you, of course, these were center chimney buildings, very solid and robust, relatively warm, one giant piece of masonry which the entire building surrounds, very compact, I suppose very efficiently built, with a minimum amount of skin on the outside and this giant piece of masonry in the center. I might note to you now, there's no public space in this building. That is no place for people to come and be welcomed from the outside. So you recall some of these buildings have extremely small front halls and a very, very tight stair right there at the very beginning. And that's basically because the house was not about that. It was about creating a very simple shelter and a very efficient shelter. So, but pretty quickly, this became a limitation for any family that had a public life. This was a little bit difficult to do because you were immediately thrust into a room without any opportunity to welcome people or to sort of provide that moment of a foyer, effectively. So the shift is pretty fast, and very quickly a center hall arrives. And it becomes the public place. So you can enter a building without entering a room. And this is a big deal, so that you can actually welcome people without their coming into your actual private space. So this notion develops pretty quickly and becomes a very, very important type. So you see here, there's, in the one case, they can be 2 chimneys or 4. And they're very subtle changes. The 2 chimney model is a kind of a doubling of the 1 chimney model. It's a little bit more efficient, but it still clogs the space in many ways. Moving the chimneys to the outside is a little less efficient in terms of heating a building, but it sure is a lot nicer spatially. So now the hallway sort of opens up generously to rooms. The hallway itself is welcoming. And so there's a kind of way of thinking that builders now began to understand that they could make a house which was more generous to the outside, and also more generous on the inside. So this type is a very flexible type, and it could be made in all different kinds of sizes. So it could be a modest merchant's house, or it could be a very, very wealthy merchant's house. All you needed to do was make it bigger, and it still worked very well. You had larger halls, larger rooms, taller ceilings, but the fundamental principle was really the same. You had a welcoming hallway, a stair, which marks the sort of size of the house to a second story, a generous stair, perhaps an open stair, but then very, very simple rooms to the right and to the left. So think about this a little bit. There is a kind of a simple 5-bay house, which we know well. It dominated the colonial period and the Federalist period. Many, many houses this way. 5 bays, central stair, 2 or 4 chimneys. If you imagine, we have a few of these. I just cut this off. We have a few 3-bay houses, kind of poor man's colonial house, with just 2 side windows. This was a possibility to think about a very modest house. But in fact, there is a way that this transitions directly into what we think of as the Greek Revival style. So now the door is not in the center, it's to the side, but you can make the house work by stretching it. So imagine you just pull forward, the stair comes forward, you have a little bit bigger house, but you still have the sort of very efficient plan, and you still have a way to organize space that's pretty simple and direct. A hallway, and then rooms after that. Now you can imagine that this idea can extend, and that in fact the simple side entryway can be extended to the front and to the back. So the house as an idea can get pretty big. You can stretch it. You can move it back and forth quite a bit. So this type, the Greek Revival type, had this tremendous advantage. It was narrower, which means that you can put a lot more houses on a block than you could the other way. And so you know that there are thousands of houses in Providence that are based on this model, which is basically a 3-bay model, which has a door on the side and a stair that goes up. Very, very simple model, and it can be stretched, it can be very long, it can have bumps and grinds on the outside, but the principle is always the same. There's a stair hall, rooms to the left in this particular case, or the right, doesn't matter, and then a series of smaller rooms that follow the stair beyond. So that's a very, very simple and straightforward model for how this type could evolve. And it really still came from the beginning of a 5-bay model. So I remind you, of course, that that building could be anything. Its arrangement is sort of the same. It's basically a kind of sided stairwell entrance. In this case, this is a house on Princeton Avenue, which is an Italianate style. Imagine you're kind of wrapping the building in a variety of different ways of making it become a physical exterior. So it could be Italianate style, could be a traditional Greek Revival style. And of course, it's adaptable. So if you take that model and you double it, you flip it over on itself, you know, you've got a big house. So we go back again to that sort of traditional model of a central hall, but it sort of is derived in many ways from that Greek Revival house, which is not big enough for a successful merchant, but is adaptable by just flipping it over on its side and making it 2 halves instead of just a single half. So then we end up with these giant boxes. Now, they are basically almost always the same. The plan repeats itself over and over again. So there's a big hallway, and big rooms on either side, and then the chimneys would follow their place depending on the occupants, depending on the layout. And so if you look at these buildings, they end up being simple boxes with very elaborate outsides. So it's sort of like a cake. You bake a square cake, and then you frost it in lots of different ways. And that makes it personal. That makes it your cake. That makes it your period, your place. So it's really a way to think about how buildings evolve. There's a plan type, which is part of the milieu of the times, and then an exterior skin, which is further refining we'll call it the style of the owner, or the style of the year, actually, that clear. So I want to mention to you, this is another problem. We can talk about the idea of the plan as somewhat problematic. It's also the problem of roofs, which are kind of a complicated deal. So you all know the Mansard Roof, which is a French invention, basically to kind of cover the top of the building. You know, there are lots of stories about a Mansard roof occupying the roof more effectively, paying lower taxes on a room that's in the roof and not having to pay taxes because it's an attic space. Some of those roofs in Paris are gigantic. This one has just 1 floor, but we've seen examples where there's 3 or 4 floors inside of a giant roof. So you can squeeze a lot of space on the top of the building. It's also the problem of weatherproofing, and that is how do you cover a large building with a roof, particularly in the 19th century. So those buildings needed to be metal of some kind because it was, you know, the kind of membrane structures or tar paper. That was not very well suited in the middle of the 19th century. So you used to have to sort of create some sloping conditions, if possible, or minimize the flat part. And the flat part ended up being metal of some type, tin or something like that, that could solder together to make a membrane that was very thin but complicated, and sort of a way to avoid that problem if you could. So the mansard is a way to cover a big plan, a big box, because otherwise it gets kind of complicated. For instance, I'll just show you this. If you had a regular roof on a big building like this, it gets very weird. It gets too tall, too broad, and there's too much room inside. It doesn't work very well. And so we can't make that a Greek Revival building because it just doesn't work. It's the wrong kind of roof. So you can imagine that the big square buildings that evolved in the mid-century, the ones that people were able to afford, and we had a lot of successful business people in Providence, those big plans were difficult to put roofs on. The Mansard roof was a perfect solution to that problem. And so there were many, many of them. And so there were many buildings that were built this way because it's a very convenient way. And you get that third floor. You get a nice a complete third floor. No dormers. You know, the dormers are kind of modest in size. They work pretty well. Well, one of the privileges of walking around neighborhoods, which Victoria and I do all the time, is you discover things that seem strange and unknowable. And so we were walking the neighborhood the last few weeks, just sort of discovering things, and we found these buildings, which were extraordinarily weird buildings. And here's the case of a giant box, which I can't quite figure out how it works. These were kind of Italianate buildings. These were actually speculative projects because I found 3 of them, 2 side by side on Mauney Street, and then 1 on Public Street, which is actually adjacent, the lots adjacent. They're kind of behind each other. So look at these buildings. Giant 3-story boxes, huge porches in the front. So I don't know how they're organized. It's kind of hard to tell. There's a door on the side that you can see from the lower right-hand picture there that you enter at some point. There was a door in the front. The sad part about, of course, so much of the building has been displaced. It's really hard to read what it was like, except you'll notice, of course, that this was probably the way the porches were, this way. And so all of those guys would have been made up this way with those columns. And I imagine, of course, that the project was stripped of those balusters and sold off at some point in time. It's hard to imagine that it would be worth the trouble to build all those terrible shingled boxes there. But nonetheless, the fascinating thing is to imagine the sort of idea of this project, a very large building with a flat roof, Italianate style for sure, but kind of invented in weird ways, sort of odd tops and so on. So the notion is to walk around neighborhoods and sort of imagine buildings and what kind of arrangement happened on the insides. Or what were those buildings like? And that's a way of understanding the larger idea of architecture, is by selecting pieces of buildings, understanding how they connect to plans and other parts of the building, and then seeing how they repeat over and over again. This is a kind of a detective story, forensic activity, imagining what it was like, why it was changed, and what the future might hold. So the 1909 plat map has those buildings that you can see there. There are the 2 of them. That's these 2. This guy is here. And you can see there's a house back here that's missing. I don't know exactly if that was the same house, a third version of this. It's hard to tell. But one of the valuable or kind of interesting aspects of this search is to sort of find these old drawings, figure out how old the house was, obviously before 1908, a very dense neighborhood at the time, and then sort of imagine the sort of construct of the whole neighborhood in those terms. So 2 weeks ago, Deborah talked about the Robert Knight House and how it's been lost, and it's used to be next door to the library here. A fine-looking house, but of course, there are others just like it. And so while we might have lost one marvelous house, and we often lose marvelous houses, wonderfully for Providence, there are so many that there'll always be another good example somewhere that will allow us to understand the life of the city at a particular moment in time. Again, these plans were probably simple and pretty straightforward. A kind of box-like arrangement, a central hall, a generous central hall to welcome outsiders, the public space within the house. But I want to remind you that there are other things happening in the middle of the 19th century. This very important work by Andrew Jackson Dowling, cottage residences, had a very, very big impact nationally and in Providence as well in terms of planning buildings. And so in this particular case, the projects are smaller, they're cottages, but it was a strategy for organizing buildings that was a little different, in fact, very different from what had come before. So we have one example, a really nice example of this style here, the gatekeeper's cottage at the cemetery, which is a pretty good example. There's a pretty clear example of the cottage style. The most important thing is the sort of cross gable idea, that you can change the axis of the roof and create much more complicated plans and still make a kind of big house. Now this is a tiny little building, but the notion was that you could begin to adjust things in the plan and in the roof structure, which made the project all of a sudden very different from any other building we'd had before this. So in my neighborhood, we have a couple of these houses, which were originally cottage farm outbuildings or houses outside of the city from the middle of the 19th century. And you can see the cross gable idea is really a terrific way to stretch a building. So now it's not a box any longer. It actually has more windows. It's very practical, right? More windows, more exterior edge, more daylight to the inside. And so it's humbler, in effect. It was not meant to be a home for a wealthy person, but rather an idea, perhaps a country home for a wealthy person. But nonetheless, this notion of the cross gable and this verge board actually came out of what do you do with all these gables? And all of a sudden you have all these gables. And so you needed to do something to bring character to those. And so we have this tremendous amount of decoration in the gable ends, right? This is a very important hallmark of this period, with the very elaborate verge boards or barge boards that are crafted to be unique and special as a function of the roof configurations. Cross gables, a lot of them, more space, different dynamics of planning, quite complicated plan arrangements. Not so simple any longer, a little bit informal. The public spaces were not the sort of straight-on formal conditions. It was more a country kind of living idea. Another variation in the 19th century, which is pretty wonderful actually, is the Octagon Phenomenon. This happened in the middle of the 19th century. This fellow, Orson Squire Fowler, was a phrenologist, and he was a very successful lecturer. I guess he was the 19th century version of a TED Talk guy. Long TED Talks, you know, those talks were very, very long. And he thought there would be a better way to build a house. And that would be to make a very efficient exterior envelope. Well, as you know, a circle has the least surface area to cover the greatest ground area. So the surface area of a circle captures the most floor area most efficiently. Square is not so efficient. Octagon's kind of close, right? It's close to a circle. And so it's an efficient plan. It's relatively shallow in the relationship of windows to spaces. So Fowler thought this was a great way to build. And so we have a lot of these buildings around. We have a couple in Providence. This was the one that we have locally on Public Street that was restored by the revolving fund. It's now owned by a family. Before and after pictures. This is I know it's very pale. The upper plan is one plan online, which is part of the catalog of plans that were made. You can see it's extremely efficient. There are no hallways. So part of this plan, part of the concept of the Octagon house is efficiency. Central chimney, no hallways, very, very thin exterior walls, easy to maintain in theory. Now, the bottom plan, which is a little faint, is the plan of the house on Public Street. And this is a little different. You'll notice in the plan on the top part, the stair takes a side, pretty good chunk of that real estate to move up and down. But the one on Public Street uses a tiny corner, which is this little space right here. That's the stair. It's extremely tight. You couldn't possibly move anything up those stairs. The steepest stairway. It's amazing how tight that stair is. This actually, I think when I was working with Clark on this, he figured out it was actually built as a two-family house because the stair, which was a historic stair, very, very steep stair, led to an upper level. So it was a very nice stair, closed off from the downstairs. So it might have been built as a two-family. Kind of hard to believe. But notice, of course, the idea is no hallways, very, very efficient plan. You arrive in the middle room and you move around to the outside rooms. It's a kind of a quirky idea, but actually we have a few examples in Providence, which is kind of cool to know about. I was walking around again. We're searching, just walking the neighborhood, and we found this wonderful small identical octagon house on Crescent Street. This is on Mashpog Pond. Hasn't been touched. I have no idea what's on the inside, but it's there, probably built at exactly the same time as the house on Public Street. And of course, we all know the giant one that's on Elmwood Avenue, and I don't know what the plan looks like on that. But this was a serious movement, very, very different in direction from all the other projects. These houses have no public space, right? They are meant to be extremely efficient, and it's intriguing to see how you might develop an idea for arranging spaces in this plan. I remember when I worked on this project, I gave the octagon plan and dimensions to my students. And I said, can you figure out how to make a house out of this? And I have to tell you, they failed terribly. I mean, there was no way. Nothing came up that worked very well. The present plan that is on this, that was a part of the existing plan in Public Street, it's not too bad. Works pretty well. Pretty tiny rooms, but nonetheless an interesting idea for plan making and understanding how buildings might work. I want to remind you that even during this period of the Octagon houses, some major wonderful buildings were being built in Providence. The central hallway has a variation which is apparent in the Lippert House and Woods Gary. And there are several big houses in Providence that have the hallway to the side. And this is a really, really important variation. This is a heroic plan type because the hallway now is completely free and it becomes a giant reception hall. So you can think of the stair as encumbering space. It's a big chunk of real estate, takes a lot of room. So if you could get it out of the way, you could have a dance in the hallway. And so the moving of the stair to the side changed the axis. So you'd come in and then you'd have a large stair to the right or to the left. And as you know, that connection reaches to a porte cochere, or kind of a carport entrance. Both Woods Gary and Lippert House have the same arrangements. They have a side entrance and a main entrance and the giant stairway off to the side. The stairway is very, very elaborate. But it creates a public space that's free and extends this idea of the public occupation pretty radically. So it's a nice type. So I just want to remind you again, we're always talking about a simple box in most cases, except in these rare cases like the cottage style, the octagon house, we still end up kind of with a box. And we decorate the box, okay? It's a simple box with a very elaborate exterior decoration. You choose the kind of frosting that you wish. I want to remind you that this is a set piece, that we create sets for ourselves that are about our lives, and those can be changing all the time. It's like the clothes we wear. They are costumes of the period, and they can be changing all the time. Well, the body is the same, and that's a pretty common way of thinking about architecture. This is a long history of this in the United States. It's not, you can imagine this, the false front is a term we all understand. In the West, of course, many of these buildings were erected in the East, disassembled, put on wagons and brought out west, and then oftentimes erected in front of tents temporarily. So, but you had a facade, you had a building, you had a kind of image that allowed you to open your business, and you could create a street. So the notion of a sort of vertical flat surface, a facade, meant urbanity, like civilization had come. So the making of an exterior skin is an intention that most of us as architects understand is really, really powerful, just as powerful as the plan. Well, for me, I think the reason that I wanted to do this talk was the Victorian Queen Anne period. Victoria and I have a Queen Anne house. I've always been amazed by the energy and the kind of elaborativeness of these plans. They are extraordinary. So it occurs to me that something radical happened in about 1880, where there was enough extraordinary economic success nationally. There were many, many families, many businessmen, very successful, having decent amount of money, and they wanted something new. Literally, I think they wanted to cast off the old ideas of making buildings and had an opportunity to create something new. They actually did not have a lot at stake in terms of what was happening in the past. it was all about the future. And the future meant new ideas, new developments, new industries, all kinds of things were happening were brand new. It's a wonderful time to be an architect because you could invent everything. And so what we see now are these extraordinary changes in building plans, that all of a sudden the rules of how to organize things seem to go out the window. And so the plans become very radical. They're not box-like at all. They're sort of crazy and they're all over the place. There's just this extraordinary explosion of forms and shapes and materials and colors. It seems like there's this moment in time when every possible creative opportunity was exploited, that every single shape was examined as a possible roof configuration. You pile one thing on top of the other, and of course to do this on a plan, frankly, is very complicated. This is not easy to do. So you can imagine if you have a box, you can have fun all day drawing kind of pretty frostings on the outside. Nothing changes on the inside. But to do a building which has this very complicated plan is very hard because there are many, many things that work, many complications to sort out. So oftentimes these buildings have, as many of you, some of you own these buildings and you live in them, you realize the plans are oftentimes awkward. They seem a little weird. Moving around is not so easy sometimes. You end up in places that you're always surprised at. You come to the top of a stair and you wonder, how did you get here? And this is really a function of a kind of testing out of ideas, a way of working which is much more spontaneous and I think genuinely creative. This is an opportunity to be inventive and to not use past practice as the way to make things happen. So we have thousands of these houses, and the thousands of these houses across the country, all built for young, successful families. First generation people who have moved up and become business class and have wonderful opportunities to make new buildings. And so what follows, of course, are the pattern books. Many, many books, many plans, many opportunities to buy a plan and build a house. And so while we can imagine architects crazy at work in Providence doing these houses, in fact, most of them came from these pattern books. Only the very wealthy could hire an architect to actually do a house for them, and those houses were fantastic. But there are vast quantities of quite wonderful buildings that are made from pattern books. And there are very elaborate plans that you could buy. Apparently, by the way, this house that you see for $2,000, that's the cost of the house, which is hard to believe, because in small print you could buy the plans for $20. So the house apparently was $2,073. So what I'm intrigued with is the large number of modest houses that are really very inventive, that are filled with quirkiness, different materials, different shapes and forms, but modest in size. And this is pretty extraordinary. This is an opportunity for what we call middle class people in the 19th century to actually own a piece of architecture of some distinction. And there are many of these, as you know, when you walk around the neighborhoods. Some of them have survived and are in very, very good shape. Others have suffered badly, but nonetheless, we still have a great number of them. And they contain literally a vast vocabulary of building materials and colors and textures and forms. It's kind of extraordinary to take a look at them. And they vary in size. There are many two-family buildings of this style. They operate all over the city in different scales. These are all from the neighborhood, by the way. Some of them are in tough spots and they suffer as a result. Others are hidden away and have been able to sort of maintain their status and their character. Many of these houses are broken up into multifamily or rooming houses, some of them not. And so they have suffered, in some cases badly, in other cases not so much. But occasionally you'll find a gem. And I have to say, walking the neighborhood again last week, we came across 83 Comstock, and this is a fabulous, wonderful little house that has the kind of subtleties of plan arrangements. It's not so radical. It has a few of those pieces of ins and outs and porches, but it's been well cared for. It's a part of the history of this movement in which different materials, different textures, different shapes all come together, and it survived in great shape. And once in a while in research you find an actual model, a perfect model. So this house at 40 Princeton, which you can take a look at when you walk around, it came out of one of the pattern books. There are many of these. So here's the house. It's a nice little building. It's got a few variations. Of course, there's a bay window in the pattern book house. A photograph of the house is built. But you notice the plan. It's a small house. It's pretty efficient. But there's a typical of the Victorian Queen Anne style. There's a front hallway, which is the size of a room. And that's a really important aspect of this idea. So this brings me back to the notion of the public space. So now, basically, we enter a building which has a lot of remarkable things in it and represents the kind of idea of the family, all there right in that one spot. So you come in and you can begin to understand all the rooms. It's a very efficient plan. So it works out pretty nicely from that point of view. By the way, I know you might be able to not see this in the back, but do you notice anything missing from this plan? There's no bathroom in this plan. So most of the plans in the pattern book do have bathrooms, but this one did not. So I'm not sure what the story is with this, whether there was an outhouse in the back or not, but nonetheless, there's no bathroom in this particular plan. So I want to just read this to you because it's so interesting. It's one of the pattern books, and it sort of testifies to this sense of publicness in these houses. So the narrow, cold, and cheerless staircase hall will soon be a thing of the past. The hall now is made a useful and beautiful feature of every good design. It should be square rather than long and narrow, thus making it a room rather than a passage. It should have a fireplace, not only for the sake of comfort and beauty, but for the reason that a fireplace in the lower hall ventilates the whole house more or less. The impoverished air from adjoining rooms, adjacent rooms, and from the upper floors, as we know, bad air is heavy and descends, is attracted to it and carried off. It should have a beautiful staircase, not necessarily expensive, with risers not over 7 inches, treads not less than 10, and at least one platform to afford a rest and make ascent easy. Winding steps should never be built where they can be possibly avoided. It should display some stained glass, if stained glass is wanted. The hall does not require full light. A subdued light is better. It should have a hat and coat closet. It should be protected from the cold and draft by a vestibule or storm doors during the winter season. So this is an idea of the Queen Anne style which almost all these houses have. And it happens to be our house has this hallway, which is identical to the description. And there are so many of them. They're throughout these house types, and they're really quite wonderful. So we have a stair, a fireplace, no winders. There used to be a stained glass window at the end of that stairway. So all these features, including the foyer, were present in many of these houses. So this is 84 Melrose Street, and you can see from the plan that there is a front porch, there's a little tiny vestibule, there's a room size foyer, which is almost bigger than any other room in the house, with a fireplace in the corner and the stair which winds up. So this house, like many of these houses, came from a pattern book, but then was adjusted according to the whims of the owner. So the pattern book, the plans would be bought, to sit down with the contractor, which is exactly what happens today, and the owner would say, well, I want this a little bit bigger, I want this a little smaller, and then this negotiation would happen, usually to ill effect, to tell you the truth. Sometimes the results weren't so good. And I know in many of these houses, particularly this house, the adjustments from the pattern book rearranged the structure a little bit, which caused a lot of deformation in the floors, a lot of settlement, and a lot of problems. But nonetheless, there is that attribute of the stair, the fireplace, stained glass, a foyer. All these things are present in many of these houses. Now, to our crowning Queen Anne victim here at 49 Princeton Street, which of course is going to be on the tour. This is an amazing house. In its exterior, it is really the prime example of the aspiration of the Queen Anne style, which was to be as inventive as absolutely possible. So, you know, the idea that you would construct a building that would contain many unique and we'll call it creative options or opportunities is very apparent in this house. At the same time, interestingly enough, the plan of the house is not that remarkable. So it's sort of as if all of the energy was sucked out of this project on the outside, and there was nothing left on the inside when they got all through. So you notice from the plan that's pretty straightforward. The foyer is modest in size here. There is no fireplace in this particular foyer, and this upstairs plan is very regular. It goes straight to the back. So the plan itself is fairly conventional, but of course the building is moving back and forth and in and out, which is a very typical idea in this period. Also, there are room change sizes, and this idea of the octagonal shape dominates many of these houses. There are many, many cut-off corners, that this extension of the rooms out into space. These are all aspects of this plan, trying to break out of this idea of the cube or the box as much as possible. So we admire this building because it contains so many irrational acts. And it takes extraordinary courage to do this. I mean, there's so many things that one wouldn't do. The notion of this little porch, the scale of which is wrong. It's too small, it's too low. It's as if at a last moment the architect said, I want to have a porch, but I don't want it to be too big, and it goes crashing into this corner of lattice work that is over the stairway. So there are many elements in this project like that, but nonetheless, it's so rich and it's so complete in its invention that you can't help but admire it and love it for that purpose. So I remind you that for me, the notion is invention. That, and of course, all the colors have been washed away here. We'll have a 5-color scheme shortly, which allows all the building parts to be articulated and understood as separate pieces, that you could read them more clearly and understand them. And this idea, and even including the finials and the roof, all these are textural elements. All these are inventions to allow the designer, the architect, to sort of explore ideas and for the owner to appreciate the sort of extraordinary opportunities that are available. I want to remind you one more time about a couple things here in the neighborhood. The Queen Anne style was pretty brief, really. And it's a fascinating idea. It reminds me a little bit of, the Queen Anne style is kind of the Gothic architecture of domestic American architecture. Gothic buildings are, we like them, they're fantastic, but they're really pretty ugly. They're big, hairy beasts. And so the Queen Anne style is that way. It's a kind of a overambitious, fussy project, and not to the liking of a lot of people in the end. And it sort of became almost vulgar because it was so fussy and so messy. So quickly, I would call it the sort of sophisticated architects of the day understood the sort of possibilities that could occur when you freed yourself from the box and began to develop very sophisticated plans and very sophisticated exterior elevations that smoothed out these rough edges and talked more about form and more about shape and less about sort of the fussiness of all that stuff on the outside of the buildings. So the shingle style evolved out of that period where there was a cleaner look, and there's a few wonderful examples that you'll be seeing on the walking tour on Whitmore Street, particularly these two, which are a hallmark for the shift from very, very fussy buildings to ones which are much simpler. But they still have good plans, very interesting plans, very unique and special arrangements of floors. So from Scully's book, this page on the left, which shows plan making and wall making. And then, of course, on Lexington Avenue, when you walk around, you discover this building, which is, in fact, right out of the pages of those books. You have to kind of stop and look because it's completely buried behind some big trees and needs a little work. But nonetheless, this notion that you could kind of coalesce some of the ideas from the Victorian period, you could kind of thin them out, smooth them out, make them less fussy, began to happen. And I think that's a good sign that the shingle style was becoming an important way of thinking about buildings. So there are a few around town. There are not a lot, but there are a few. They have simpler shapes, more generous use of materials, not so fussy, and nice buildings. So the notion that there's a shift which occurs And it happens pretty quickly. I mean, I would think that in a decade, this whole explosion occurred and began to fade. And so that's a reality, and the shift occurs in buildings pretty quickly. This is one picture out of this pattern book that I found, and it's a house in Providence. I said, that's interesting, I wonder where this house is. So I actually found it. It's on Adelaide Avenue. It's the exact house. So I was stunned. It's all there. All the porch railings are still there. Everything's there. So this is a kind of shift, because while this house is more like the other ones we looked at, this is more box, this is more central hall, stair to the side, it has that traditional grandeur. It was in the Victorian House book. So there begins to be a kind of shift even in the literature of that period on what kinds of things were doable. So we have the box with more subtle and sophisticated additions. A rounded porch, a little bit of a crazy dormer, but not too much. It's a kind of adaptation of the really radical ideas that came earlier. So I find this conversation revealing of this change. So this is 118 Princeton and 125 Princeton. One side of the street and the other side of the street. So we can see the Webster Night House returns to the classic, we'll call it John Brown moment, right? A giant central hallway, big block of a building with some subtle adjustments on either side. But then across the street, the George Smith House, which was actually built 2 years later, is actually it's still a part of that tradition of invention. There's still a very, very convoluted set of shapes, a lot of round porches happening. So there's a kind of struggle culturally at this moment about what should the future of architecture be. And I think we know the answer to that question. The answer basically was more stability, more tradition, simpler ideas. I think the traditional idea won out. So clearly the next not even full generation of successful business people and manufacturers and all of the support people who were very prosperous at the time felt as though they had to go back to the colonial tradition to actually express their cultural sensibility, that they knew about history, they valued the colonial period and what it meant to be an American. And so that shift was really radical. So very, very quickly, we moved back to this idea of a four-square house. Well, the question is, where are we now? Things haven't changed very much. We still look back, it seems to me, culturally. And it's ironic that the insides of this big giant house in the Hamptons has exactly the same stairway as the Victorians suggested. So some aspects of that culture, some aspects of that moment, some aspects of that invention hung on. And that, particularly the idea of the public space being more elaborate, being more generous, being a kind of sign of wealth, being welcoming. All those characteristics did hang on, and they remain in various guises. In the contemporary McMansion, the same idea prevails. The scale's off. It doesn't work very well. It's oversized for the building. But nonetheless, the notion that there is a publicness to the entrance to the building, which I really think manifests itself most explicitly in the Queen Anne style, still exists today and still a part of the heritage that we think about in making buildings. So now you can go to the Webster Night House and take a look and think about that. And as you roam through the buildings during the house tour, try to imagine that relationship of the street into the house. Those porches are an anteroom as well. They're an exterior room. And so even that motion, that kind of idea of porch, is a part of the elaboration of a plan. So now you can look not only at the rooms as individual elements, and we'll call it sort of idea of place, but also the publicness of these buildings and how they begin to relate together. And using the Webster Night House as an example, you can just imagine, since it's there and you can look at it, you can find the generosity of the hallway, understand the location of the stair, how the big rooms relate to that, and sort of then connect that to your own experiences with other houses, your own houses that you have, because our city here is filled with wonderful places. So that's it. Thank you very much.